My name is Maren Whitaker. I'm 39 years old. 9 years ago, my husband and my younger sister forged my signature on a membership transfer and took the surgical clinic I built from nothing while I was 3 rounds deep into chemotherapy for stage 2 breast cancer. They left me with $247,000 of equipment debt I had personally guaranteed, a second mortgage on a house I no longer owned, and no health insurance in the middle of active treatment. Last month, I sat at a back table at the Grove Hotel in Boise, while the Idaho Medical Association named Wade Whitaker, 44, their Physician of the Year. He walked to that podium in a rented tuxedo and told 400 doctors that the hardest thing he ever did was carry a clinic through his wife's illness. The room applauded. Then the MC leaned into the microphone and said the award would be presented by the chair of the Idaho State Board of Medicine. And I stood up. My sister Junie dropped her champagne flute on the parquet floor. My 9-year-old daughter, Iris, took my hand and walked up those steps beside me. And I watched Wade's face come apart in front of every single person he had spent 9 years trying to impress. Before I tell you the rest of it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had somebody look right through you like you were furniture and then live long enough to see them find out exactly who you were. I want to start with the parking lot because that's where it actually happened. Not the boardroom, not the courthouse. A parking lot behind a strip mall on Fairview Avenue in Boise, Idaho on a Tuesday in March, with hail coming down the size of aspirin. I had just finished my 4th infusion. If you have never done ACT chemotherapy, I'll tell you what nobody puts in the pamphlet. It isn't the nausea. The nausea you can medicate. It's the way your body stops belonging to you. Your fingernails lift at the beds. Your mouth tastes like a handful of pennies for 11 straight weeks. You lose your eyelashes last, and you don't understand until they're gone that eyelashes are what keep dust out of your eyes, so you spend your afternoons crying for no reason at all, and everyone around you thinks you're falling apart when really you just have grit under your lids. I was 40 pounds down. I had a port in my chest under a bandage the size of a playing card, and I was sitting in a Honda Pilot in a parking lot with the engine off because I did not have the strength to lift my arm to the ignition. My sister, Junie Kovacs, 35 at the time, my clinic's office manager, had driven me. She had my folder in her lap. Junie had been driving me to every appointment for 4 months. She brought me those orange popsicles from Albertsons because they were the only thing that didn't taste like metal. She sat with me in the chair while the adriamycin went in, and it looked like cherry Kool-Aid and burned my vein like a lit match. She held the trash can. She washed my hair in the kitchen sink until there wasn't any hair left to wash, and then she shaved her own head. And we took a picture, and I put it on the refrigerator. I want you to understand that I loved my sister. I want you to understand that, so the rest of this lands the way it landed on me. She handed me a pen in that parking lot. She said the leasing company needed a signature to defer the payments while I was in treatment. She said Wade had already looked it over. She said, "Just sign the tab, Mayor. It's the deferral. You're gonna fall asleep. Sign it." I want to be very honest with you, because I've read the comments people leave on stories like mine, and I've seen what they say. How could you be that stupid? Why would you sign something you didn't read? Who trusts family with money? Here's my answer. And I've had 9 years to get it right. I signed it because it was my sister. Because that morning she had cut the crusts off a piece of toast and stood there while I ate 3 bites of it and cried in the bathroom afterward where she thought I couldn't hear her. Because I had a needle hole in my chest and my white count was 700 and I could not read a paragraph without the words swimming. Because when you're that sick, the world narrows down to whether you can make it to the car, and you outsource everything else to whoever is standing closest. The document I signed was not a payment deferral. It was a membership interest transfer for Cottonwood Reconstructive Surgery, PLLC. My clinic. 82% of it moved to a new holding entity in which I owned nothing. The signature I put on that page was real. The 4 pages behind it, the ones with the operating agreement amendment removing me as managing member, those signatures were not. She traced them. She was good at it. She had signed my name on insurance forms and vendor checks for 6 years. It was the most ordinary thing in the world for her to write my name. I found out on a Thursday. I had a good week, which is what happens right before the next infusion. My hands stopped shaking. I drove myself down to the clinic on Emerald Street, the one I opened at 30 with a small business loan and a co-signature from my father-in-law, and I badged in at the back, and the light didn't turn green. I thought the reader was broken. I stood there in the alley with a bag of takeout in my hand, in a knit cap, because it was 38 degrees and I had no hair, and I pressed my badge against that little box 11 times. Yolanda Prieto came out to me. Yolanda, 56, my surgical nurse for 9 years, the woman who scrubbed in on the very first case I ever did in that building, a hand reconstruction on a line cook who caught his palm in a Hobart mixer. Yolanda came out into the alley and she had her hand over her mouth. She said, "Maren, they told the staff you resigned." I laughed. I actually laughed, standing in an alley behind a dumpster, because it was so absurd. I said, "Resigned from what? It's my name on the sign." Yolanda took my elbow and she walked me around to the front, and I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign, and it said Whitaker Aesthetic and Surgical Group. Not Cottonwood, not mine. Wade came out. My husband, 14 years married, anesthesiologist, board certified, a man who had never in his life stayed late to close a chart. He came out onto the sidewalk in his fleece vest, and he did not touch me, and he did not look at my head. And he said the sentence I have replayed maybe 11,000 times since. He said, "Maren, you're not well enough to run this business, and everybody but you can see it." Then he said, "Come inside, you're making a scene." And behind him, in the doorway of the clinic I built, holding a clipboard I had bought at a Staples on Overland Road, was my sister. Junie didn't say anything. That's what I remember. She stood in the door with her hair growing back in a soft gray fuzz, the same as mine, because she shaved it for me, and she looked at the ground. I went home. I got as far as the driveway. There was a black Chevy Tahoe in it, and a man in a windbreaker taping a notice to my front door. The equipment lease. $247,000 on a C-arm fluoroscope, and a fractional CO2 laser, and an autoclave and a Mayo stand. And every single thing I had signed a personal guarantee on back when I was 30 and immortal. The holding company that now owned the clinic had defaulted on the lease intentionally, which is a thing you can do. And the personal guarantee had not transferred with it, which is a thing that happens when you don't read 4 pages. The house had a home equity line of credit against it that I had not opened. $91,000 drawn down. My health insurance was through the practice I no longer owned. I found that out 3 days later, when St. Luke's called about pre-authorization for Infusion 5, and a woman named Kim, who I do not blame and hope is happy, told me my coverage had terminated on the 1st of the month. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen with the phone in my lap, and I stayed there until it got dark. There's no dramatic scene here. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just sat on the linoleum with my back against the dishwasher, and at some point I noticed I was cold. And I thought, without any feeling attached to it at all, I'm going to die on this floor, and it's going to be a relief. I want to tell you about the 3 people who didn't let that happen, because they are the whole reason I'm here, and because for 9 years, the only thing I've wanted, more than justice, is for somebody to know their names. The first knock came at 9:40 at night. Errol Whitaker, 71, retired diesel mechanic, 31 years at the Union Pacific Yard in Nampa. My father-in-law, Wade's father. He came in without being invited, which he had never once done in 14 years, and he looked around my kitchen at the notices on the counter and the empty prescription bottles, and he sat down on the floor next to me. 71 years old, both knees replaced. He got down on that linoleum with me, and it took him about a minute and a half. He said, "I called my boy." He hung up on me. Then he said, "I want you to know something," And then, I don't want to talk about it again. I raised him. Whatever this is, it's got my fingerprints on it somewhere. So I'm gonna be here. Errol had $116,000, which was his entire retirement outside of Social Security, and he tried to hand it to me that night in the form of a check he had already written before he knocked. I said no. He put it in an envelope in my mailbox anyway, and I found it 4 days later, and I cried harder over that envelope than I had over any of it. I gave it back, but I let him drive me to Infusion 5. The second was Yolanda. She quit. 2 weeks after they changed the sign, right in the middle of a Thursday, she took off her badge and set it on the front desk. 56 years old, a mortgage, a son at Boise State. Wade offered her a raise to stay, and she told him, in front of 4 patients in the waiting room, exactly what she thought of him, in Spanish and then again in English, so nobody would miss it. And then Yolanda drove to my house and put a manila envelope on my table. Inside it was the original operating agreement of Cottonwood Reconstructive Surgery, PLLC. The real one, from 2015, with my real signature and Wade's real signature, dated, notarized, filed. Because Yolanda had been the one who drove it to the courthouse that year, and Yolanda, who does not trust anybody with paper, had made herself a copy and put it in a shoebox in her closet. She said, "I don't know if this helps." The third one was Desmond Boone, 47. Attorney. Solo practice above a mattress store on Vista Avenue. I did not know him. Yolanda's brother-in-law knew him from church. And that is the entire pedigree of the man who spent the next 2 years of his life on me. He read the amendment for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he took out a magnifying loupe, the kind a jeweler uses, and he looked at the signatures for another 6. Then he leaned back and said, "Doctor, whoever did this pressed too hard on the downstroke. You don't press hard when it's your own name. Your hand knows the shape." She was drawing it. He took the case pro bono. Actually pro bono, not deferred, not contingency. He billed me $1 in 2017 so it would be a real engagement, and he framed my check. I asked him why once, about a year in. He said his mother had been talked out of her house by a man she married at 62, and he'd been 15 and hadn't been able to do anything about it. That's it. That's the whole reason. Men carry things like that around for 30 years. Here is what I want to say about those 2 years, and then I'll move on, because I don't like living in them. Desmond could not undo it. That's the part nobody tells you. Forgery is a crime, but a criminal referral goes to a prosecutor with 140 open cases, and a felony forgery charge on a first-time offender who is a nice-looking white woman with no record ends in a diversion program. Junie did 400 hours of community service and a record-sealing petition. She never spent a night in jail. The civil case was worse. Wade's attorney argued I had signed the transfer page myself, which I had, and that the rest was a dispute of fact, and that as a party to community property in the state of Idaho, he had every right to restructure a marital business asset. It took 19 months. Desmond's stopped the bleeding rather than winning. He got the personal guarantee reduced to $182,000 and structured over 11 years. He got the HELOC pushed back onto the marital estate in the divorce. He got me 11% of nothing because they'd already stripped the entity. The night the settlement was signed, I sat in his truck outside the courthouse in a wig that cost $60 and made my scalp itch, and I said, "I lost." Desmond looked at the windshield and said, "You're alive. You've got a license. That's not nothing. That's a loaded gun. Most people don't get to keep the gun." I finished chemo on a Medicaid expansion plan and a GoFundMe that Yolanda started without asking me, and that raised $9,400, mostly from patients. A woman whose son's ear I rebuilt after a dog attack sent $40 and a note that said he's in the Navy now. I want to be careful here, because this is the part in every one of these stories where a woman gets rich in one paragraph, and I hate that because it's a lie, and I think the lie hurts people. It took 9 years. The first 4 were not a comeback, they were a job. I worked as a contract surgeon for a wound care group. I drove to Twin Falls and Pocatello and Idaho Falls 300 miles some days, doing debridements and flap coverage on diabetic feet in strip mall clinics with bad lighting. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment on Curtis Road with a window unit and a mattress on the floor. I paid Desmond's structured settlement on the first of every month, $1,380, for 11 years, and I never missed once, not one time. And if you want to know what actual revenge feels like, it feels like $1,380 leaving your checking account on a Tuesday morning for 11 years. Somewhere in year 3, I noticed something. Every burn survivor and every mastectomy patient I met in those little clinics had the same story. Insurance covered the resection. Insurance covered the amputation. Insurance covered the part that saved your life. It did not cover the part that gave it back to you. Reconstruction after mastectomy is federally mandated, sure, but try finding a surgeon in Salmon, Idaho. Try getting a contracture release on a burned hand when you're on Medicaid in a county with 2,000 people. I wrote a business plan on the back of a Chili's placemat in Burley. I did not have money. What I had was a license, a state with 800,000 square miles of nobody, and a Medicaid waiver program that would pay 11 cents on the dollar for reconstructive work if you could do it at volume in an ambulatory setting. Desmond incorporated it for me. Errol co-signed again, at 74, for $140,000 against a house he had paid off in 1998. Yolanda came out of a job she liked to be my first and only employee. We opened in a converted dental office in Caldwell, 1,300 square feet. I did 406 cases the first year. I named it Cottonwood because they took the name off my clinic, but you cannot copyright a tree. Year 5, we opened Ontario, Oregon. Year 6, Twin Falls and Elko. Year 7, a Reno private equity group offered to buy us, and I told them no, and then their operating partner asked if instead I'd let them fund a leasing arm. Because the single biggest cost in a surgical startup is the equipment, and I had figured out how to buy C-arms at auction and refurbish them. That's how Cottonwood Medical Leasing got born, not glamorous. We lease fluoroscopes and lasers and autoclaves and Mayo stands to small surgical practices across 4 states. We are the boring company that sits underneath 111 other companies. Nobody knows our name. We don't have a sign. Understand what that means and hold on to it because it matters later. By year 8, there were 14 Cottonwood clinics across Idaho, Eastern Oregon, and Northern Nevada. We had done 19,000 reconstructions, 68% Medicaid. We were the largest provider of post-mastectomy reconstruction in the Intermountain West, and almost nobody in Boise knew who I was, because I never once went to a cocktail party. Now, the 2 things that actually made me happy, since they're the only parts of this I'd want you to have. Owen Ward. He teaches high school band in Meridian. He drives a 2011 Corolla with 206,000 miles on it. He makes $52,000 a year, and he has never, not one time, asked me what I make. I met him because his marching band did a fundraiser car wash in the parking lot of my Caldwell clinic. And I came out to tell them they couldn't, and he had his sleeves rolled up and a bucket in his hand. And he said, "Ma'am, we've got 11 kids who can't afford the Chicago trip, so I'm gonna push my luck." I let them stay. He bought me a coffee to say thanks. That was 7 years ago. There is no billionaire in my story. I want to be extremely clear about that because I think we do damage to each other when we pretend somebody rich shows up at the end. Nobody rescued me. Owen Ward has never rescued me from a single thing in his life. What he does is he sits on the porch with me at 10 at night and asks how the Elko case went and actually listens to the answer. And then he tells me about a sophomore who finally learned to tongue a staccato passage. And we are both talking about the same thing, which is the small daily business of putting people back together. And Iris. Iris came to me at 4 years old with 60% total body surface area, burns from a house fire in Nampa that killed her mother, 15 procedures over 3 years, contracture releases on both hands, an axillary release, tissue expanders on her scalp. She had no family. There was a caseworker named Pam and a foster placement that kept failing because burn scars need daily care, and daily care is not something a system does well. She used to hold my thumb during dressing changes. I would count backward from 10, and she would squeeze on the even numbers. I filed for adoption in year 6. It took 14 months and a home study and a judge who asked me why a single woman with a company would want a medically complex child. And I said, "Your Honor, she's not medically complex. She's just been on fire. And I know exactly what that's like." Iris was 9 last spring. She has a scar on her left hand that runs from her wrist to the base of her ring finger, and she calls it her river, and she is not remotely ashamed of it, and I have to leave the room sometimes when I think about that. Owen and Iris and Errol and Yolanda and Desmond. That's my family. Every single one of them I chose, or chose me, and not one of them shares my blood. Now, the other thing. In year 7, the governor appointed me to the Idaho State Board of Medicine. It's not a glamorous job. 9 members. You meet quarterly in a conference room on West State Street. You license physicians. You investigate complaints. You revoke licenses. And you approve certificates for ambulatory surgical centers. I did not seek it. A woman named Priya Raman, who sat on the board and had sent me 11 patients, put my name in. I almost said no. Then I read the roster of open matters, and I saw on page 4 an application for an ambulatory surgical center certificate. Whitaker Aesthetic and Surgical Group. 3rd location, Meridian, Idaho. I sat in my kitchen with that packet in my lap for a long time. Iris was doing long division at the table, and I want to tell you that I felt triumphant, that lightning went through me, but the truth is I felt nauseous. Actually, physically sick. The same taste in my mouth as the adriamycin, because for 9 years I had not said Wade's name out loud, and there it was in 12-point Times New Roman, and I still had a scar under my collarbone where the port went in. I called Desmond. It was 11 at night. He answered on the second ring, because he always does. He said, "Recuse yourself." I said, "I know." He said, "Maren, I mean it. You have a documented history. You touch that application, they'll come after your license and they'll be right to." I said, "I know, Desmond. I'm going to recuse. That's not why I'm calling." I told him what I'd found in the packet. And Desmond Boone, 47 years old, a man of God who has never in 11 years said a curse word around me, was quiet for a while and then said something I won't repeat. Because here's what was in the packet. To get an ASC certificate in Idaho, you disclose your equipment. You disclose your lessors, your service contracts, your financing. It's 4 pages of the most tedious document in state government, and nobody reads it. Wade Whitaker's 3rd clinic was equipped with a refurbished C-arm fluoroscope, a fractional CO2 laser, 2 autoclaves, and a full sterile processing suite, leased from Cottonwood Medical Leasing. He'd gone through a broker in Reno, the way everybody does. He had never seen my name. He never would have. There are 11 entities between the broker and me, and the top one is called an LLC with a number in it. He was making a payment of $11,200 a month to a company I owned 88% of, and he had been doing it for 2 years and 4 months. I have thought about this a great deal, and I want to say the true thing. I could have called the note. That afternoon, there was a covenant in that lease, standard boilerplate, that lets the lessor accelerate on a material adverse change, and Desmond found 3. I didn't, because I sat in my kitchen and I watched my daughter do long division, and I understood something about the 10 years I'd just lived through. If I pulled the plug in month 28, Wade and Junie would have gotten to tell the story. They'd have said a bitter ex-wife came out of nowhere. They would have been the ones who were wronged. They'd have gotten to keep the version of themselves they'd been performing for 9 years, which was the version where they were good people who did a hard thing to save a business. And Maren was a sick woman who couldn't cope. I did not want their money. I had money. I did not want their clinic. I had 14. I wanted the story back. So I recused myself from the application, formally, in writing, in front of the board, and Priya Raman handled it, and it was approved on the merits, because it met the criteria, and I want you to know that too. I never touched it. The Meridian Clinic opened in October, and I let them keep going. Junie signed a lease on a fourth location in Eagle. Wade traded up to a Range Rover on a 72-month note. I know because it's in the credit pull that any lessor is entitled to run annually, and Cottonwood Medical Leasing runs them every year in the second week of January like clockwork, on all 406 lessees, no exceptions. They put $140,000 into a rooftop patio at the Eagle location. They hosted a launch party. It was in the Idaho Statesman. My sister wore a green dress and she'd let her hair grow long. I read that article at my desk. Yolanda came in with coffee and read it over my shoulder and said, "How are you not on fire right now?" And I said, "Because they're building it taller. That's the whole thing. That's the only piece of wisdom I have. They were spending money they didn't have to build a version of themselves that wasn't real. And every foot they climbed was a foot they'd have to fall. I didn't have to do anything. I had to be patient, and I had to keep my hands in my pockets, and I had to let them get all the way to the top. The Idaho Medical Association gives out a Physician of the Year award every spring. There's a black tie dinner at the Grove Hotel. It's a fundraiser, mostly. The award is decided by a nominations committee I have never sat on. Wade won it, nominated by his own practice manager, which is legal, and which is my sister. The citation talked about entrepreneurship and rural access, and a physician who had personally guided a surgical practice through the illness of a family member. That last part was in the printed program. I have the program. It's in a drawer. 2 weeks before the dinner, the IMA's executive director called me. Routine. The Board of Medicine chair traditionally presents the award. She said, "You'll present, yes? It's just a handshake and a photo." I said, "Who's the recipient?" She told me. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and I could hear Owen upstairs running scales on a trumpet with a practice mute in it, and Iris laughing at him, and I said, "Yes, I'd be honored." Then I hung up and I sat down on the floor. Same floor, different house. I told Owen that night. He was quiet for a long time and then he said, "You don't have to do this." I said, "I know." He said, "Is it going to make you happy?" And I said, "No, but I think it's going to make me finished." I told Errol. He was 79 by then, on oxygen at night. He said, "You want me to come?" I said, "It's your son." He said, "Maren, I've had 30 years to think about which one of you I'd sit next to. And I made up my mind on your kitchen floor." Errol Whitaker put on a suit he bought for his wife's funeral in 2004, and he sat at table 31 with an oxygen concentrator in a bag under his chair. I sat at the back. Nobody looked at me twice. 9 years and a wig I no longer needed and 40 pounds I had put back on. And I have never once had my photograph in a medical journal. I wore a navy dress. Iris wore a green cardigan over a dress with a high neck, her choice, because the sleeves are long and she likes long sleeves at parties, and she sat next to Yolanda and colored on the back of the program. Junie was 4 tables from the stage. I watched her for 20 minutes. She's 44 now. She was drinking champagne and touching Wade's shoulder every 90 seconds. There was a hardness around her mouth I didn't recognize. And I recognized everything else, because she has our mother's face. Wade got up when they called him. He walked to that podium and he unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket and he looked out at 400 physicians. And he said this, and I am quoting him exactly, because I have listened to the recording 11 times. He said, "There was a period, about 10 years ago, when I nearly lost the practice. My wife at the time was very ill, and the business was failing under her management, and I had to make a decision. I've never talked about this publicly. It cost me my marriage. But those clinics employ 91 people today, and I'd make the same call again." The room applauded him. Errol Whitaker took his oxygen cannula out of his nose and set it on the table and stared at the ceiling. Then the executive director came back to the microphone and said, "Presenting our award tonight in her first year as chair of the Idaho State Board of Medicine, and a woman I'll confess I had to look up because she doesn't come to these things, Dr. Maren Whitaker of Cottonwood Reconstructive." I stood up. I want to describe what happened to the room, because it happened in the wrong order, and I've never forgotten it. The applause didn't stop first. It faltered, like a needle skipping, and then a woman at table 9 said something to the man beside her and put her hand over her mouth, and it moved outward in a ring, and then it hit table 12, where Junie was, and my sister turned around in her chair. Her glass hit the parquet. It didn't shatter. It just bounced and rolled, and the champagne went across the floor toward the stage, and nobody picked it up. It stayed there the whole time. I remember stepping over it. Iris got up with me. That wasn't planned. She just stood up, 9 years old, and took my hand and walked with me down the center aisle, and I let her because she has never once in her life let go of my hand at the wrong moment. I walked up the 4 steps. Wade Whitaker was standing at the podium, holding a crystal obelisk. He had it in both hands, and I watched every muscle in his face try to solve a problem it could not solve. He looked at me, and then he looked at the little girl beside me, and I know what he was doing, because he's a smart man. He was doing arithmetic. He was trying to figure out how old she was and what that meant. I took the microphone. I did not say a word about him. I want you to hear that. I said 31 seconds about the Idaho Medical Association's Rural Access Fund. Then I turned to him and I said, "Congratulations, Dr. Whitaker." And I put out my hand. He had to take it. 400 people were watching, and there was a photographer 8 feet away. And he had to take my hand. And it was the first time we had touched in 9 years. And his palm was so wet I felt it come off on mine. I leaned in. It looked like a friendly thing. It looked like 2 colleagues in a photograph, and that photograph ran in the Statesman the following Tuesday, and if you look at it you will see me smiling. And I said quietly into his ear, "The C arm in your Meridian OR. Serial number ends in 419. I bought it at auction in Sacramento in 2019 for $11,000. You've paid me $406,000 for it." Then I let go of his hand and I walked off the stage with my daughter. He stood up there for maybe 9 more seconds. Then he said, "Thank you," into the microphone, and it came out wrong. And he walked down the wrong set of steps. Now here is the part where you might expect me to tell you that everything collapsed that night. It didn't. Nothing collapses in one night. That's another thing the stories lie about. It took 11 weeks. The first text came at 2:11 in the morning, 4 days after the dinner. He got my number from his father. I want to say that plainly, because I've heard people ask how these things happen, and the answer is boring. Errol has had my number for 19 years. Wade went to the house in Nampa and sat with his dying father, who has congestive heart failure and could not get up out of a chair to stop him, and he took the phone off the side table and looked. And Errol told me the next morning and cried on the phone, and I told him he had nothing in this world to apologize to me for. The text said, "I know you're up. I know how you sleep. Let's not do this through lawyers." Then at 2:31, I never touched that amendment. Junie handled the filings. You know that. Then 2:44. You're going to put 91 people out of work over something your sister did. Then 3:02. Say something. I did not answer. I never answered. Not one of the 47 messages he sent between March and June, and I have all of them, and Desmond has all of them, and every single one of them is now part of a record. What I learned in 9 years is that men like Wade have one weapon, and it's your reaction. He needed me to argue. If I argued, we were 2 people with a version of events, and versions can be litigated in a lobby, in a text thread, at a dinner party. Silence gave him nothing to push against. Every message he sent into a room with no walls, and he got louder, and the louder he got the more he wrote down, and everything he wrote down was true and terrible and admissible. Then Junie came. Our mother, Bettina Kovacs, 68, had a stroke in May. I was at St. Alphonsus every night for 11 days. Junie and I had not spoken in 9 years, and we spoke about 8 sentences a day, all of them about ice chips and the aspiration risk. On the 9th night, Mom was asleep, and Junie followed me out into the corridor by the vending machines, and she put her hand on my arm. She said, I need you to hear me. I stopped. I let her talk. She talked for 11 minutes. She told me Wade was the one who'd designed it. She told me she'd been 35 and getting $14 an hour to manage a practice she ran single-handed while I did surgery. And she'd been angry, and she'd let him convince her it was temporary. She told me she'd driven to my apartment on Curtis Road twice and sat outside and couldn't do it. She told me she thought about it every day. She said, I shaved my head for you. And she said, I'm asking you as your sister, are you going to destroy me? Here's where I could have screamed at her. I'd rehearsed it. For 9 years I had a speech, and it was a good one, and it had my hair in it and the popsicles and the trash can and the crusts cut off the toast. I didn't say any of it. I said, the Board of Medicine received a complaint on March 11th regarding Dr. Whitaker's ASC certificate application. As chair, I'm recused. It'll be handled by the vice chair and outside counsel. She stared at me. She said, That's it? Maren, I'm telling you I've thought about this every single day for 9 years. I'm telling you my marriage is. And she stopped, and I saw it, and I did not react. I'm telling you I'm sorry. And I said, I heard you. She said, Say something, please. Just tell me you hate me. Do something. I said, Mom's going to wake up around 6. She likes the raspberry ones. And I went and sat back down to our mother's bed. I have gone over this 1,000 times. People will tell you that was cruel. Maybe. But I want to be precise about what I owed her. I owed her nothing. Not my forgiveness, which she wanted so she could put it down. Not my rage, which she wanted more because rage would have made us even. She wanted a transaction. She wanted to hand me 9 years of guilt and take back 9 years of mine. You do not have to accept that trade. Nobody tells women that. You are allowed to stand in a hospital corridor and say I heard you and go sit down. The hearing was on the 12th of July. It was not technically about the forgery, because the forgery was 9 years old and adjudicated. It was about 11 pages of the ASC certificate application. Specifically, question 14. Has any owner, officer, or managing member been subject to a criminal disposition, civil judgment, or administrative sanction related to the practice of medicine or the operation of a medical facility in the preceding 15 years? Junie's diversion agreement. Sealed, yes, but a sealed record is not a non-existent record. And the question asks about disposition, not conviction, and there was a civil judgment with Wade's signature on the settlement. And Desmond had it, and Desmond had filed the complaint himself as a member of the public on the 11th of March, because I could not and would not and never did. They answered no. 9 board members, 1 recused, which was me. I sat in the gallery in the 3rd row like anybody else. Iris was in summer camp. Owen took a personal day and sat next to me and held my hand under his jacket the entire 4 hours and never said anything. Wade testified. He was very good for about 20 minutes. He is a genuinely charming man, and I want you to remember that because charming men are the whole problem. Then outside counsel put up the text messages. I never touched that amendment. Junie handled the filings, and then, 3 exhibits later, the 2016 email from Wade to the paralegal at his attorney's office, which had been produced in discovery 9 years earlier in a civil case nobody ever read because I settled. Have her sign the transfer page only. Will conform the rest. Will conform the rest. 4 words. 9 years old. Sitting in a banker's box in Desmond Boone's storage unit on Federal Way, because Desmond Boone does not throw anything away, ever, in his entire life. The board voted 7-1, license suspended 18 months, ASC certificate revoked, referral to the Attorney General for the false statement on question 14, which is a felony in the state of Idaho. Wade stood up when they read it. He turned around and looked at the gallery, and he found me, and he said my name out loud in a hearing room. He said, Maren. And the vice chair said, Dr. Whitaker, the board has received your statement. This concludes this portion of the hearing. And that was it. 2 bailiffs, a door, a hallway. I did not feel anything. I want to be honest about that too. I walked out to the parking lot and I got in my car and I sat there, and Owen got in the passenger side, and I said, I thought there'd be more. He said there never is. So, the ends of things. The Whitaker clinics closed in September. 91 people did lose their jobs. And Wade was right about that, and I have to carry it. Cottonwood hired 34 of them. 2 of the physician assistants work for me now. And one of them cried in my office on her first day and told me she'd always wondered what happened to the woman on the old sign. Junie moved to Bend, Oregon. She sends a card at Christmas. I don't open them, but I keep them in a drawer, and the fact that I keep them is a thing I discuss with a therapist named Gwen on Wednesdays. Wade took a plea. Withheld judgment, 5 years probation. Restitution. He's 44, and he can't practice medicine until he's 46, and he never will, because you can suspend a license, but you cannot suspend what 400 physicians saw in a ballroom. Our mother died in October. Junie and I sat on opposite sides of the bed and held her hands and did not speak to each other. And afterward, in the parking lot, she said, "Thank you for the raspberry ones." And I nodded, and we drove away in different directions. Errol Whitaker died in February. He was 80. I was holding his hand, and Iris was reading to him from a book about diesel engines that she did not understand a word of. He was buried next to his wife in Nampa. His son did not come. His daughter-in-law arranged everything and paid for everything and stood at the head of the grave. And if that sentence doesn't tell you what family means, then I can't help you. Yolanda Prieto is our chief clinical officer. She has an office bigger than mine, which was not an accident, and she still scrubs in on Thursdays because she says a nurse who doesn't touch patients is just an administrator with a story. Desmond Boone is our general counsel. He kept the office above the mattress store. He said the rent's good and the mattress people are quiet. Owen still teaches band. He is not going to stop, and I would not let him if he wanted to. His marching band went to Chicago 4 years ago, and they will go every year for as long as I am alive. And no student of his will ever know who paid, and neither will he, officially. And I opened the 15th clinic in March, in Payette, and there's a sign on it that says Prieto Reconstructive, and Yolanda saw it for the first time from the parking lot, and she sat down on the curb. Last Sunday, Iris asked me to teach her to suture. I got an orange out of the bowl and a needle driver from the drawer, and I sat her at the kitchen table, and I showed her how to load the needle, how to pronate the wrist, how to lay a knot flat. Her left hand doesn't fully close. She's figured out her own grip. She's better at it than I was at 19. She said, "Did the man at the party really do that to you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you still mad?" And I put down the orange and I thought about it for a long time, because she deserves a real answer and she always has. I said for a while, being mad was the only thing holding me up. And then one day I noticed I was standing on my own, and I set it down, and I didn't pick it back up. She thought about that. Then she went back to her stitches. Here's what I know. Rock bottom is not a metaphor. It is an actual floor. Mine was linoleum, in a house I lost, and I know exactly how cold it was, and I know how long I sat on it. And what I want to say to whoever is sitting on theirs tonight, at 2 in the morning, listening to a stranger's voice, is that a floor is the only thing you can push off of. You cannot push off of air. They will tell you that success is the best revenge. I don't think that's quite right. Success was not revenge. Success was just what happened while I was busy refusing to die. The revenge, the actual revenge, was that 9 years later I could stand in a ballroom holding my daughter's hand and feel absolutely nothing when he said my name. And I want to say one more thing, because it took me the longest to learn. Junie and Wade were not my family. That's not a bitter thing to say. It's a technical correction. My family is a 71-year-old mechanic who got down on the floor next to me when it took him 90 seconds to do it, and a nurse who kept a shoebox in her closets for 6 years for no reason at all, and a lawyer who framed a $1 check, and a band teacher who never asked me what I made, and a little girl who calls a scar a river. Blood tells you who you're related to. It doesn't tell you a thing about who's coming when you fall. Look around the room you're in tonight. Find the ones who would get on the floor. Then go build something so tall and so quiet that when their lies finally come apart, you don't even hear it happen.